Today is the day that Saigon fell in 1975. And the world changed because of that. Remember the helicopter on top of the embassy? And, well, it's pretty bad. Last week, I spoke about our ancestors. It does us well, as John Quincy Adams pointed out, to speak to our ancestors. Now that they're gone, I think that we live in a culture that's very different than that culture. For one thing, back in the day, people condoned owning of slaves. Not more than, 150 years ago, it was a common practice. If you had the money, you could own slaves. Slaves were not considered people, but property. One criminal act that was dealt with very seriously was slaves that ran away, because that was property owned by white landowners and business people, and they spent a lot of money retrieving their property that they paid a considerable amount of money to buy. Well, way in the back of the Bible, there's a predicament that Paul had, and I'm doing some reading on Paul lately. He had to endure the dealing of a runaway slave. Oddly enough, the name meant useful, which is really Onesimus. Writing from prison, Paul had to deal with the issue of returning Onesimus to the rightful slave owner, Philemon. And here's the dilemma. Should he send Onesimus back to Philemon, as the law dictates, because runaway slaves could be killed, or harshly treated? Now, you may think that's no dilemma at all. I wish it were that simple. Unfortunately, throughout the centuries, all the way up to the Civil War, people have rationalized owning slaves. And it's happened here, in this land. Many otherwise kind, reasonable thinking people in the South owned slaves, and seemingly they thought nothing of it. It's amazing how terrible attitudes and actions can be rationalized in the name of religion. Besides, Philemon was part of a society that condoned this slave ownership. If he acted kindly towards the runaway slave, what would the other slave owners think of him? Going soft. Seems like a no-brainer to you and me, but it wasn't evident to the people of the time. Sometimes, when we go back in history, it hurts. And even worse, it might be that Philemon said that Onesimus stole something from him before he left, before he ran away. So he had a lot of reasons not to feel too kindly about Onesimus. But Paul wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted Philemon to have the opportunity to do the right thing as well. So Paul sent Onesimus back to Philemon with the letter. The letter became the book of Philemon. And he asked Philemon to welcome Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as an equal. Maybe that's asking too much. He even makes a little play on words here in regarding the name Onesimus. He says, formerly he was useless to you, but now he's become useful to both you and me. And his name meant useful. Fascinating name. Once he was useless, but now he is Onesimus, who is useful. It leads me to believe that faith itself is really the faith of a second chance. Oh, we love a second chance in our society. Remember Colonel Sanders? He was fired because he was too old at the age of 65. He worked in a kitchen, but he had the recipe of a chicken, fried chicken. And at the age of 65, he started his dynasty of selling chicken, KFC. J.C. Penney lost everything he had in his department stores. And at the age of 68, he got it all back. And then there's Muhammad Ali. who refused to stand up and take the oath to serve his country in the armed services because he didn't understand what that war was all about, the Boxing Commission decided, well, we're just going to take away your license. They had no real right to do that, in my opinion, but they did it anyway. But there was Muhammad Ali on March 8th, 1971, the comeback with Joe Frazier. And he won twice again the championship of boxing. You see, you understand, this is the heart of our theology. That's what the aspect of faith is all about. Every one of us useless at one time or another, when in fact we're all useful to each other because of the human spirit. You don't have to be a criminal or a prostitute or a runaway slave to qualify for a second chance. Sometimes you can be wealthy. Sometimes you can be educated. Sometimes you can be cultured, while at the same time being prideful and snobbish and condescending. You qualify for a second chance. The police one time got a report, so they went out to look and see what this report was all about. People called in and said, the strangest thing, we see somebody driving in a huge parking lot in reverse, in circles. Well, they wanted to see, they stopped this girl, and she got out, and she said, well, my parents let me use the car, but I put too many miles on it. So she didn't want to get into trouble, so she said, I was just trying to rewind some of it. Well, there are parts of our lives, I think, that we would like to rewind. If driving around the block in reverse would expunge your record, we would go all over the parking lot and rev up our engines. We would do it. I would do it. But something more is needed. And there's something called the Daily Guidepost magazine. Scott Walker wrote a piece about Eddie Dwyer. And for decades, he was a professor of New Testament at Baylor University. The students really loved Eddie. Eddie died in 2006 at the age of 92. Scott Walker participated in his funeral, and he said that when Eddie Dwyer was in the 8th grade, the teacher assigned a term paper. And he warned them he wouldn't accept late papers. And several days later, Eddie came down with the flu. He missed 3 weeks of class. He couldn't finish the term paper. It wasn't on time. And the teacher refused to give him a second chance. Angry and frustrated, Eddie emptied his desk. He packed his books up. He dropped out of school, 8th grade. For the next 3 years, he picked cotton and worked jobs in the midst of this Great Depression they were having. And one day, a businessman approached Eddie on the street, said, Eddie, I see a lot of good in you. You're a hard worker. And you got a lot of promise. And if you go back to school, I'll buy your books for you. Eddie was 17. He was embarrassed to go back to the 8th grade. But late that night, he decided, yes, I'm going to accept that man's offer. Not only that, he graduated from high school at the age of 21. Now, how sad it would have been if he had not gotten that second chance. He went on to become a sterling character of wide-ranging influence. Francis Hubbard once served as a chaplain of the McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, the psychiatric wing of the Massachusetts General Hospital. And during that time, there was a high percentage of people undergoing treatment for alcoholism. That they, oddly enough, these are people that received religious training when they were kids. However, the vast majority of these alcoholics received one message in their training. One mistake, and you're going to hell. Well, one of them said, since we're going to hell anyway, we might as well enjoy the ride. The lesson They were giving the children were rules without grace, forgiveness, or new life. That face is too small, says Francis Hubbard. The real people of faith forgave those who hurt them. The real people of faith offer redemption to those people who have fallen. The real people of faith offer renewal and restoration to people yearning for a second chance and a third chance, and maybe even a fourth chance. And I stand before you in conflict. I know of 3 people that are still living that I cannot forgive and will not. Now, never is a long time, so I'll never say never. But I cannot do what I just told you. We're in it together, you and me. And that's all I can say about it. It's kind of like a mulligan. The golfers like to golf. A mulligan is a do-over. You had a bad shot, take a mulligan and replay the shot. It's not really legal in golfing rules, but, well, if you have a few rounds with your buddies or during the charity tournaments, sometimes they sell mulligans for charity. You can buy like 3 or 4 of them, and it sounds like the sale of indulgences back in the day when Martin Luther lived, you know? I know some people that feel that maybe they shouldn't have given all that money to get into heaven, you know, because, well, anyway, fortunately, we don't have to pay for a second chance. That's because of something called grace, amazing grace. And I represent today to you that second chances are the heart of faith that is in all of our lives. Sometimes the biggest obstacles to receiving a second chance is the attitude of people like me who have trouble forgiving. Just because a person bears the name of being a Unitarian Universalist doesn't mean that they have the heart of forgiveness. I mean, I knew of one minister who told me about a woman going through a divorce. The woman's father was very strict. He was a fundamentalist pastor. And when she moved out of the home and filed for divorce, her father refused to ever talk to her again. She was never welcome in that church that her father was the minister of. And her family cut her off and acted as though she was dead. She herself had grown up in that kind of rigid, legalistic faith, and the divorce itself tore her apart. And divorce often does that. She said she finally came to the conclusion of it all, that her divorce was what she was told was a sin. When you look at the damage that it does, you can't come to any other conclusion, she said. But she thought it was a forgivable sin. Ultimately, we're in the business of forgiveness and offering second chances. Someone said that religious congregations are the only group that come together that when they see that their fellow congregants might be in trouble, they shoot the wounded. Shoot them. Don't help them. Sometimes the critical judgment, unforgiving attitudes of other religious people hinder people in need of a second chance. I found that to be the case of all places in church where people espouse these things. They don't give it because they probably don't receive it. Well, Ambrose Bierce wrote, there are 2 classes of people, righteous and the unrighteous. Classifying is done by the self-righteous. And so often it is true. Barry Bailey is a minister of a mega church in Fort Worth, Texas. He talks about 2 of his friends, Gene and William Tucker. William is chancellor at Texas Christian University. And an article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram featured, they're coming to terms with the fact that Gene's oldest nephew had died of AIDS. Rather than hide the tragedy, she said, I'm going to make this public. Her nephew was an artist. The doctors had some of his paintings in his home. They loved him very much. But what made Jean decide to tell the story was that following her nephew's death, someone came to her trying to bring comfort. You ever go to some of those funeral homes? I did, many times. And people end up saying things like, don't they look wonderful? I'm telling you, no, they're dead. They're dead. How could they look wonderful? But you don't say it. Oh, goodness. They've gone to a better place. Really? How do you know? I mean, it's just things that people say because they can't take the silence. They got to say something. Well, one person said, I'm so sorry. And she thanked that person, Jean. Then the person asked, what did he die of? And she replied, he died of AIDS. Oh, I'm sorry anyway. I'm sure the other person didn't mean to be hurtful when they said, I'm sorry anyway. It's just that it's easy to condemn death by AIDS in a way that we would never do with death by cigarettes or death by fast driving or death by overeating or a host of other ways that we hasten premature death. Fortunately, we don't have to label people except with one label: forgiven. Our faith is one of second chances. Even if some religious people can be the biggest obstacles to people seeking those second chances. I've been given a second chance. So you ask yourself, wait a minute, you've been given a second chance, so how come you can't give somebody else that second chance? What is it that caused you to say that you can't forgive somebody? You know, it's funny, when you give the sermon out, last week I gave the sermon out to people just to test to see if they're going to say anything. Well, when you give it out, you better be ready for what's coming. We were talking about forgiveness, and they said the reason you can't forgive others is because you can't forgive yourself. What? Oh. In 1 John 7, it says, the arm of flesh will fail you, and you can't even trust yourself. And it is true. If you don't value who you are, if you don't value and believe in yourself and understand you're going to make mistakes and keep on going, well, if you don't do that, well, then you cannot forgive other people as easily. Well, you do understand that Philemon is being given a second chance as well as Onesimus. Forgiveness is for the forgiver, not the forgiven. How did he respond to Paul's request that he be lenient with Onesimus? Did he punish his former slave? Did he come into peer pressure of his friends who were slave owners? Well, we don't know. Did he grant him his freedom so that he might return to Paul? I don't know. We really don't know. And maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't know that. Legend has it that Onesimus became the bishop of Ephesus, but that's just a legend. I'd like to think it's true, not just for the sake of Onesimus, but also for Philemon. It was a test of his conversion. Before, he was a man of rules, but no grace. I think that's the question for each of us today. I suspect that each of us has somebody in our sphere of influence that we are a bit harsh with and judgmental. It might be a family member or a neighbor or a coworker. At some time or another in the past, that person offended us or hurt us or betrayed us, and we have a difficult time forgiving. And I don't feel good about that. I don't feel good that I just told you that I can't do that. I cannot forgive 3 people. I can't do it and won't do it. But I don't feel good about that. I want to do it. And that's my dilemma. As we have a difficult time forgiving, we act civil. Maybe. But deep down, we are distrustful, we're resentful, and we have a hard time keeping it from showing. At least I do. Maybe it does show. Maybe our temper flares more easily than it does normally. Once we feel hurt or betrayed, we think to ourselves, that person doesn't deserve another chance. And that might be true. Lots of times we've done something to somebody at some time, and we were forgiven and accepted. It may be the hardest thing you have to do, to forgive somebody who's done you wrong. But let me remind you, it takes a lot of energy to be unforgiving. And of course, you know, I would quote, who would I quote? You know who I would quote? Mahatma Gandhi. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attitude of the strong people. I think he's right. Are you strong enough to forgive? Are you strong enough to give somebody else a second chance? How can you forgive somebody else if you can't forgive yourself? Let me take you back to something dear to me, to the Amish country. You know, the Amish they're a select group, and the fellas have these great beards but no mustache, and they make great furniture, and they don't use electricity much. They don't use modern conveniences of any kind, really. And when I went over there to visit, you know, when I was younger, I used to soup up the car for my date, you know, get it waxed and everything. Well, I saw one young man waxing his buggy. And I thought, gee, now that's great. It's the same principle, but great idea. Well, they stick to themselves, and they have very strict rules for their community to follow. And they don't really, you know, there's a lot of criticism about them, too. I had criticism about them. One day, for a reason that nobody can figure out, a man who lived near the Amish community, who was not Amish himself, went into a one-room schoolhouse with his rifle. And some Amish children were being taught there. And without speaking, he opened fire on the children, and he killed 6 girls. The Amish community was devastated. The killer shot himself right there and died. This senseless mass killing was beyond anyone's belief or understanding. Immediately, the elders of the Amish community met. They tore down the one-room schoolhouse. They raised money for the surviving families of the murders. Unbelievably, they raised money for the wife and children of the man who killed the innocent little girls. The wife of the man who killed himself was beside herself with grief, disbelief. The elders had brought her money and supplies, knowing she too was a victim and would need assistance. She tried to speak. No words came out of her mouth. The elders looked at her and told her to forgive him because they already have. They tore down the one-room schoolhouse. These Amish people would not let the evil of the murder of those girls have that last word. I would never forgive somebody that killed my children. I couldn't. They forgave him and told her to forgive him as well. I can only categorize that forgiveness as grace in the midst of disgrace. Maybe it's a lesson for all of us. It's certainly a lesson for me. You either hate and be angry or you forgive. I, for one, would love to be able to say that I would forgive. And I wonder if I have the strength to do it. Is there somebody you know that deserves or even doesn't deserve another chance, a second chance? Is there somebody you need to forgive? You have the strength to be able to give that person a second chance somewhere along the way. that so many of us have been given. We'll have the last word. What's the last word? It's not these innocent lives that are lost. It's to be able to rise above it. It's up to you. It's up to me. Remember, only the strong can forgive. Amen.